10 o'clock. John, can you start off on?
Yeah. Anyway, Dick, what I wanted to do was kind of go back on the history of the sage-grouse. Back in the beginning, so we can kind of see the timeline and when things kind of got out of control as far as being done legitimately under NEPA and FLTMA. Now, I understand when Joan Souther out of Burns was in charge of the project, she came up with, what, like 5 draft proposals. And Fish and Wildlife was supposed to choose one, you know, to move forward on the draft process of the EIS. Am I correct so far?
Well, it goes back even further than that. How this whole thing started was that there was a grouping of environmental groups that, through the Endangered Species Act, they filed a petition with Fish and Wildlife Service for listing of sage-grouse as endangered. And that started the whole process of the Fish and Wildlife Service following, you know, the procedures in the Endangered Species Act to respond to that petition. And at the time, everybody was following along with, you know, procedures that have been used for almost 20 years. And the first thing that happened is that Fish and Wildlife Service formally accepted the petition, and then they started their process. And they went out to all of the agencies, including the federal agencies and the state agencies, and started gathering information about the status of sage-grouse in the West. And they worked on this for a couple of years. And they had participation from the BLM and the Forest Service throughout the West, plus the Fish and Wildlife agencies of all of the states, plus all of the field people of Fish and Wildlife Service. And they were supposed to come together and then come up with the recommendation as to whether or not sage-grouse were in fact warranted for protection under the Endangered Species Act. That never happened. And nobody officially knows why, but everybody surmises that after 2 years worth of work and a lot of canned studies that were done by Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of the Interior, internally they came to the conclusion that they could never make the case for putting sage-grouse on the endangered species list. At this point, the Secretary of the Interior, through the Fish and Wildlife Service, threatened the federal agencies that unless they adopted new management criteria and management planning, that Fish and Wildlife Service would have to find the sage-grouse warranted protection. Well, that wasn't according to the Fish and or to the Endangered Species Act. That was just a decision that was reached by Secretary Jewell. And so then, since the Department of the Interior is over both the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management and the Fish and Wildlife Service,
Interior's,
the agent, pardon?
Interior Department is not over the Forest Service, that's USDA.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, you're right. But in any case, what she threatened to do was to have the sage-grouse found as warranting protection, even though their process didn't come to that conclusion. That she truncated the process. And so the BLM and the Forest Service agreed to modify their resource management plans to incorporate protections for the sage-grouse that would preclude their listing under the Endangered Species Act. And so in order to modify all of their standing resource management plans, they had to initiate a NEPA process, and then once they went through the NEPA process, then they were free to change the resource management plans to meet the requirements of the secretary. And then that started a 2-year process that was set up to where basically both the BLM and the Forest Service would go through the resource management planning process, which is based in, for the Forest Service in the regional office and for the BLM in the state offices. And so we started a process, a collaborative process among all of the agencies here in Oregon to develop guidelines and resource management plan modifications that would meet the Secretary's criteria for precluding having to list the sage-grouse. At the end of that 2-year period, the BLM, and I'm not really familiar exactly what happened with the Forest Service, but I know that the BLM, that the state director issued a draft environmental impact statement for modifications of all of the resource management plans in Oregon. And at this point, all the user groups that had participated in this, including the agencies, basically had signed off on it. That there was nothing in there that they liked, but there was nothing in there that they really could oppose. And if this was going to happen, this was probably going to be the best thing we could get here in Oregon. And as part of that whole thing, it was based on the science that had come out of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the USGS, who was brought in now as a research resource for Fish and Wildlife Service. The net result was that it wasn't bad proposals for changing the resource management plans. Everybody was going to have to give a little bit, but the bottom line was that withdrawal of land within Oregon was not part of the draft environmental impact statement issued by the Oregon State Director. So all these state plans went back to Washington, and they were all basically pretty similar. None of them had any large withdrawals of federal land proposed in them. So it goes back to Washington and falls into the black hole, and about 9 months later, all of a sudden, what came out of Washington was the final environmental impact statements for each one of the states that was radically different than the drafts that have been submitted by the states. In the interim, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Interior Department had contracted with USGS for additional studies, and then there were several studies done by environmental groups that were submitted that were adopted by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And the net result was we had a whole new set of environmental impact statements based on new information that had never been publicly viewed or commented on. And the Interior Department imposed these new final impact statements on all of the areas. As a result of that impact statement, or those impact statements, then the Secretary issued her order of segregation, and we started the withdrawal process. And then the agencies then took that, the information in those new environmental impact statements in each state, and they started developing plans for implementing the other things, such as the grazing restrictions, transportation plans, all of the other things that would be impacted in the current resource management plans that the BLM and the Forest Service are using to manage the federal lands. The BLM just, in the last several months, has issued planning manuals that direct how the BLM is supposed to change the resource management plans for all of the different aspects of the plans except for mining. There has been no memorandum issued yet on mining. So there borealis is where we were and where we're sitting right today.
Now, when I went through, Dick, and went through Fish and Wildlife's report for Oregon that was released in, 2011, I think, which was the start of the field study. Human-caused problems to the population of sage-grouse, there was no mentioning or study done on mining. The only thing they had concern was fence strikes and road encroachments in their study. The USGS report that was done, the only thing they found where humans were causing any problems with sage-grouse was the use of insecticides, and that the government, when they sprayed for grasshoppers, was the worst offender.
Oh, yeah, and then, but it wasn't only till, it was in the interim between when the drafts were released by the states and the final was released by Washington, that there was a new USGS study that determined that human activities significantly impacted the success of sage-grouse, and that's where they came up with their magic exclusion zones, that they recommended that a zone around each lek of, I forgot what the number is now, do you remember the exclusion zone? Where all activity had to be prohibited within that zone for the further protection of sage-grouse.
Yeah, they called it their...
And that was a study that wasn't available during the draft review process, and it came out incorporated in the final as one of the reasons for the necessity of doing the withdrawals, but it's never been vetted. I mean, it was never peer-reviewed outside of USGS, and it was never vetted through public review and comments.
Yeah, they called it their conservation buffer distance estimates for sage-grouse A review.
Yes, yeah. And so that's one of the problems with the whole process. So.
Now, on the withdrawal itself and the management, there was a lawsuit filed, and a judge threw out the management plan, but even though the withdrawal was an amendment to the management plan, he said it stands on its own.
Well, I forget what the total number is now. There was a whole series of lawsuits filed after the Fish and Wildlife Service released the final EIS. In the 5-state area, there was, I know, the governor of Idaho, there was Utah, there's a group of grazing organizations in the east. There's a whole litany of different court cases, each arguing a different point that are sitting in the courts right now. Plus the fact there's also a lawsuit in Idaho that was filed by the Center of Biological Diversity and somebody else that includes another petition to Fish and Wildlife Service to still list sage-grouse as endangered even after all this process we've gone through.
Dick, this is Brad Winters. I need a little clarification. You said after the final EIS, on the withdrawal, the EIS hasn't even been...
Final EIS on the sage-grouse,
okay, on the
resource
sage-grouse
management plans.
Okay, yeah, just so that we're on the same page, because the withdrawal EIS is not even out in draft form yet.
But I'm still confused, Dick. I know you and I have had this conversation before on that lawsuit. The environmentalists got the judge to make a ruling against the management plan because they hadn't listed the sage-grouse as endangered, but the withdrawal was an amendment to that management plan. So basically, if they ruled that the management plan couldn't stand on its own legs because it wasn't listed as endangered, that the amendment should go with it. And somehow he made a ruling that the withdrawal stands by itself, even though it's an amendment to the management plan?
Well, the withdrawal is something that stands on its own under FLTMA. And all it takes to do a withdrawal is for a federal agency to petition the secretary to withdraw a particular area. And so that's why the withdrawal is not part of the resource management process, because the agencies, the BLM and the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife Service, all requested the secretary to withdraw the 10 million acres of land in the 5 western states for protection of the sage-grouse. Once we got to that point, it's a whole separate process.
Which the process is being changed, right?
Well, the process we're going through right now is that the segregation occurred. That's an agency decision that the secretary can make on her own. That was done, and now what we're working on is the EIS that will justify the withdrawal of the 10 million acres. The 10 million acres has not been withdrawn yet. We're going through the process to where the secretary can reserve the land while the rest of the process takes place. We don't know when the draft environmental impact statement is going to be available. My latest contact with the BLM, the official response is that they refuse to provide a date, which is going to be expected. So we don't know. I mean, whereas before, they were pretty open as to when the process was going to be completed. They gave dates as to when they expected, the different parts of this whole process to be available. In this case, as of yesterday, the official response from the BLM is, we refuse to provide a date by which you can expect to see the draft environmental impact statement.
But we're coming up to a deadline in, what, 9 months? Of the 2
No, they
year?
have 2 years to do it. I can't remember. Do you remember what the date was that it was started?
Officially, I think it was March last year, but they extended it to November, and then they extended the comment period because of the delay to getting the information out. I think it put it to January.
Yeah, but the segregation is 2 years. So from the date that the segregation was initialized, they have 2 years to complete that process, or they have to go through another segregation.
Define the segregation, please.
Oh, the segregation? The secretary, under her signature, can designate lands that will probably need protection with a withdrawal. See, originally what was anticipated was, and what FLTMA originally said was, that the agency can only, that the Secretary of the Interior can only withdraw up to 5,000 acres of federal land from operation under the original mining law.
Right.
Anything over 5,000 acres, Congress intended that the Secretary would coordinate that through Congress, and the Congress was supposed to have, the right of refusal of anything over 5,000 acres. That section of FLTMA has been invalidated, so that technically today the Secretary of the Interior has unlimited power to withdraw unlimited acreage of federal lands in the United States. Now, as part of the withdrawal process, the Secretary can temporarily take that land off the table for operation under the mining laws until they go through a process that requires a NEPA analysis and a minerals potential study. When both of those things are completed, then the Secretary can make a formal determination that withdrawal is warranted, and then she can issue a land order that withdraws that land. So right now, in the withdrawal for the sage-grouse of the 10 million acres, the mineral potential study has been completed by the USGS, and that is available. The now in the draft stage. And the step one for the NEPA process in Oregon was the scoping meeting that was held in Lakeview, December 9th of last year? Okay, that was the initial step of the NEPA process. That was completed. The next step in Oregon is to release the draft EIS. And then once that's done, then to issue the final EIS after opportunity for review by the other agencies and the public. So, right now we're just sitting there waiting for the draft EIS to show up.
And we have Commissioner Winters and Commissioner Shallon participating in that NEPA process.
Okay. But I'm assuming that you gentlemen haven't been told what the date for the draft is yet either.
I've not seen anything.
Yeah, yes, I have, and where we sign an MOU and all that information is considered confidential, it is I'm not able to disclose a lot of that while we're sitting here in a public meeting, Dick.
Yeah, and see, this is the first time I've ever heard that the process of a NEPA document has been placed under a cloud of secrecy.
Well, no,
I've never heard of that before.
I'm talking about the MOU that the county signs with as a cooperating agency through the process of what I'm able to,
I realize that. I mean, my contacts in the BLM were quoting me the same thing, that they are prohibited by direction of management not to release the probable date of the draft environmental impact statement.
so.
I mean, like I said, I've never heard of that before. Always before, there's always been a target date for, whatever public document they're preparing.
Okay,
We
well.
may not meet that date, but at least we have a date, to expect it.
Well, what I can say is there's several of us frustrated with the date and the time for being able to respond to the draft before it goes out to the public on draft. We're very frustrated maybe having that discussion. I do have a question as the time frame for all this, and we do have a change of leadership at DC with Trump coming in. And do you have any predictions on this process and how that could impact where this is halfway through the process of the 2-year process? Do you speculate that there might be some changes?
Well, first of all, before I guess about that, there's something else that impacts directly on what you just said about a participating agency and working with the federal government. I sent John a link the other day about a process that the BLM is undergoing now called BLM 2.0.
Yeah, I gave them all a copy of it.
Yep, we have a copy.
All right, now that to me is for you gentlemen is very, very dangerous, because what it says and the interpretation that I've received is that this is an attempt to change the planning guidelines and the planning requirements of the federal agencies to, quote, consolidate decision-making power in the Washington office instead of having decisions made at the local level. Now, the practical impact of that I've received from BLM is that under FLTMA requires the coordination and cooperation of the planning process of the federal agencies with the local government. Under BLM 2.0, that's going to be changed to wording such that the local governments will be presented with the opportunity to comment on the decision after it's made. To me, that's really radical.
So on this 2.0 rule, proposal, who would make that policy or law? Would that be Congress? Is that?
Well, see, this kind of gets to the whole heart of the problem that I have with the current administration. My entire federal career, I've always operated under the premise that, the Constitution set the requirements, Congress makes the laws, and then the federal agencies take those laws and then they make the regulations to carry out those laws. And this administration has taken a different attack, and they view the laws as impediments, and they have changed the regulations at will to get around the requirements embodied in law. And this is a good example, because FLTMA is a law, and the agencies were supposed to, or are supposed to, adopt regulations that implement the requirements in FLTMA. BLM 2.0 is an attempt by regulation to get around the requirements of FLTMA. And so, whereas FLTMA says that the government agencies are supposed to cooperate and coordinate with, they're going to write a regulation that says we don't have to do that. We can make our regulations, and our interpretation of FLTMA is that we only have to notify the local governments and allow them to comment.
It's basically severely diluting the coordination policy of FLTMA.
Yeah, but then, that's not the only thing that's happened. But in my little corner of the world, that's what I've been watching happen. The whole NEPA process for sage-grouse does not follow NEPA requirements.
Okay.
I started my federal career way back when, working for the EPA, reviewing NEPA documents for all of the nuclear power plants that were being constructed around the country, mainly on the coasts. And at that time, there was a strict, rigid process that you had to follow, and if you didn't follow the process, it would invalidate your whole NEPA document. Now, they kind of throw process out the window, and one of the prime tenets of the whole NEPA process is that you put together your plan, you draft up your NEPA document that supposedly has the best science you can find, and you analyze the alternatives and you pick the best alternative. And then you put it out for comment. And if during the comment period somebody comes up with new information or something that wasn't considered during the draft process, then you have to go back to the beginning and issue an amendment to your draft environmental impact statement. And so you go back through the review process again with this new information. Well, in sage-grouse, between the time they did the drafts and the time that an entirely different agency issued the final impact statement, they did a whole bunch of new research, or at least came up with a whole bunch of new reports, totally changed the direction of the NEPA process, and came up with a conclusion that had never been vetted and never been reviewed by the public or the other participating agencies. So as far as I'm concerned, the whole Sage-grouse NEPA process is invalid. But, nobody listens to me. I'm way down the list of people.
So Dick, back to the...
Back to the original question.
I need to know who to lobby to go against this rule. Is it the House side, the Senate side? Is it the Washington office for BLM? I don't know who would adopt this 2.0 rule.
Well, it's at the high levels of the Interior and the resource agencies. They all serve at the pleasure of the President. They're up at the level that we call senior executive service. And then there are some that are purely political appointments. Those are the people that are calling the shots. The rest of them are, generally career federal bureaucrats. Whatever motivates them. But what I anticipate, to answer answer your question about who to lobby, well, Representative Walden, locally is probably going to be one of your best bets. I wouldn't hold out any hope that you could even get any of the rest of the Oregon delegation to even listen to your complaints. But on the other hand, I would surely make them aware that, you know, you're not happy with what's going on, but I wouldn't expect them to respond anything positively to rural Oregon.
Yeah.
I mean,
Dick, my thoughts is, I got this, press release on planning 2.0. What I really need to do is read it in the actual thing in depth to get a comprehension of it.
okay,
And then a letter to, because it falls under Bureau of Land Management, that's USDI, a letter to the secretary with CC to all of our congressional delegations so that they are aware and on board. I do not anticipate Secretary of the Interior doing anything to shift it, but as long as we make our arguments, because it is severely diluting FLIPMA coordination, and that should be the primary theme that we give to our congressmen and CCs.
oh, I agree. I mean, especially in a state like Oregon. I mean, the last election very clearly showed that, you know, we have a very partitioned state. You know, there's those of us living west of the Cascades, and there are those of you living east of the Cascades, and there's a horrible divide there. I mean, are you all familiar with the gentleman named Andy Kerr?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, when this whole thing started, you know, when they were talking about the Oahu Canyonlands National Monument, I mean, Andy stood up and bragged. He said, I can generate more letters from my environmental people in Multnomah and Washington County and Portland than you guys can generate throughout the entire eastern Oregon.
Yeah.
And it's true, unfortunately.
It is.
But the difference is those people that he can motivate here in the Willamette Valley don't have a clue what happens on the west side, or I mean on the east side.
Right.
Yeah, not a clue. It's all. Now I don't even know what motivates them. You know, it's just amazing.
Well, we saw what motivated them after Trump got elected, riots.
Well, yeah, but you know, a significant portion here in Multnomah County didn't even participate in the election process. So, you know, that doubly, you know, damns if it's, you know, if you didn't care enough to vote, then why should you be out there, you know, doing the damage?
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
the other thing I'd do, you know, if you want to go outside the state, I would certainly contact Representative Bishop in Utah.
Uh-huh.
Is it Utah?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. You know, Rob Bishop seems to be the only one that's really taking anybody on this thing, and he's just been reelected, so he's head of the National Resources Committee back in Washington. And, you know, the other one at this point that you know, I've never contacted her for, well, a long time, but Lisa Murkowski from Alaska is head of the Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, and I would certainly reach out to her, especially now since the administration has just basically dumped on her. So, but
Yeah, I think you're right. But first off, we need a response letter to the Planning 2.0 with a CC to all of our congressional delegation, of which we know that some of them are on the other side of the fence, but that's okay. But also reaching out to Bishop and the other senator, to their staff, to gather information that could help formulate our letter of protest to 2.0, because it is a severe dilution of coordination on the FLIPMA.
oh, right. Well, I mean, you know, this whole process has demonstrated that, you know, the people in Washington really jumped on. And, I mean, it was so bad that when they received copies of their final environmental impact statements, they also received copies of form letters for them to sign when anybody protested.
And
I have a lot of sympathy for, you know, for those people in management in the Oregon office, because, you know, if it would have been me, I would have been really upset about that. But, you know, that's where their paycheck comes from.
the other thing, we have quite a few county commissioners on the east side of the state that we can solicit their individual inputs also.
Well, that Delgamy report out, I think they'd be quite interested
Yes.
in the mineral revenues that are sitting in this part of the state that are basically getting a lid put on them. I understand there's still leasables, but according to Delgamy, the minerals that they found of value don't fall under leasables.
Yeah, at least where it's like petroleum and gas and others.
Which, to bring a bigger corporation in, you need the prospector to come in, do some digging around and find a viable source so these corporations might be interested.
Well, I mean, the whole idea is just, you know, it's based on a false premise. I mean, there's no reason that you need to withdraw these huge swaths of land to protect them from anything, because, number one, your market forces are going to determine where industry is going to be looking. And the existing rules and regulations you have, you know, under NEPA and under the other resource management regulations that the agencies have, you know, they've done a real fine job in the last 200 years of managing the land. We don't need to take management of those lands away from the federal agencies simply to protect them from something that may or may not ever happen. I mean, that's the crazy part.
And also, if, well, you know, the 1872 Mining Act is pretty strong.
Well, I mean, yeah, if we want to go back to basics, you know, I think a lot of what's driving this whole process, not just the Sage-grouse, but everything else, the national monuments, the wilderness acts, and all of this stuff, is simply that the environmental community has been trying to overturn the 1872 mining law for the last 50 years.
Yep.
And they've been unsuccessful to do it. I think what we're seeing now is an end run. I would predict that if the 10 million acre withdrawal goes through, that we will very quickly have everybody lose interest in the sage-grouse. Because I think the net result that what the environmental groups that are pushing this thing are looking for is not protecting the sage-grouse. It's basically to get the withdrawals on all this federal land as the first step in controlling the federal land and taking it away from the agencies.
Yeah, it's locking it up.
Which means
Well,
they're
I mean,
gonna
if you look at the total number of acres of eastern Oregon that have been withdrawn in the last, you know, since 2000, I mean, it's just, you know, it's amazing. They did a stealth withdrawal on the Steens Mountain Wilderness Act. They stole 400,000 acres there. They're doing 30,000 acres down on the coast. I can't even remember what the one they're working on now. Then there's the Siskiyou. Now that went through. That was another 10,000 acres. What, you know, somebody asked a question earlier about what do I think is going to happen. Well, I think what we're going to have to be careful of is we've got the Oahe Canyon lands, we've got the Cascade Divide. Those are the two big ones going now. The other ones are pretty much gone on. Wyden and Merkley submitted a bill on the Oahe Canyon lands. All they did was throw it into the hopper. It's never going anywhere. But what that does, it allows the secretary now, with her new unlimited power, she can do a withdrawal on the Oahe Canyon lands of 2 million acres and base it on the fact that it's in support of legislation. That's one of the things that they've established that the Secretary of the Interior can do, is that they can make a withdrawal to protect land while Congress debates creating a Wilderness Act or a national monument or whatever. create the national monument went absolutely nowhere. When Bent's got everybody stirred up and they protested loudly against the Oahe Canyon lands. Well, White and Merkley submitted their little bill, and now that gives the secretary an excuse to do a 2 million acre withdrawal on her signature. All right, well, that map has been done. And that's another area where I can't get anybody to give me a yes or no answer as whether the BLM is proceeding with putting that package together for the secretary. Walden and Bishop hauled Secretary Jewell before the Natural Resources Committee and got her to promise that she would not use agency resources in support of the proposal to create a national monument. But she never said that she wouldn't use agency resources to create a withdrawal in support of legislation. And I would anticipate we're going to see that before the end of the year.
Dick, back on the maps,
Yes.
on the Sage-grouse, the lakes, you name it. Which government agency did the science and put the map together?
Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, more or less. Well, they submitted their information, and then it went back to Washington, and the story that I heard was that the environmental groups presented the map to the secretary, who presented the map to her staff, and that was the map that went out under the Federal Register notice that it was based basically on the state stuff. It had a lot of added things, and it had some other strange things in there. For example, if you go through there and you notice that there's no relationship to the SFAs, the sage-grouse focal areas, and sage-grouse habitat, because they neglected to put any sage-grouse habitat in the SFAs that was already protected by a withdrawal. So for example, all of that area east of Albert Lake is not in an SFA, but yet the biologists admit to me that that's some of the premier habitat for sage-grouse in the state. And it's not protected in an SFA because, oh gee, it's already withdrawn. So, I mean, that's what leads me to believe that, you know, the whole map is sort of funky. Now, so since the map was drawn with a broad-based, you know, Sharpie pen on a map, then once the segregation was done, and the secretary just did the segregation in general terms, then the package was given to the BLM, who has to come up with the official meets and bounds boundaries of the SFA areas. And even this is kind of a crazy system, because they were told they didn't have the time to do an in-depth study. So they are taking the maps and they're simply looking at the map and determining whether if the line that was in the Federal Register, if it included more than 50% of a section, then that entire section is going to be withdrawn. If it has less than a 50%, then that section is going to be excluded. So it's all subjective now, section by section. The BLM's own estimate came up that when they went back through and did a real quick and dirty look at it, they're estimating that the 10 million acres that was listed in the Federal Register is actually on the map's going to turn out to be about 19 million acres. So the actual land withdrawn is going to be about double what was proposed initially.
And say that again, and where that information come from, because of, as going through this whole process, that alone would be something to say that the process is not true and accurate.
Well,
It's gotta be
well,
what,
actually, I heard it first from one of my people and my contacts in BLM back in Washington. That was confirmed by somebody that is involved in the process at the state level. That, you know, that they're going through and selecting these sections, you know, based arbitrarily on where they think the line comes.
Now, Dick, when you say at the state level, you mean the state BLM management level?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, well, because it's the BLM that does the withdrawals.
Yeah,
Whether it's Forest Service land or BLM land,
Right.
it's the BLM that does the withdrawals.
yeah, they control the minerals.
so
So,
with,
so here again, we don't have a clue until the draft comes out as to where those actual SFA boundaries are.
okay, so, I'm sure that the draft will state exactly how many acres in each state. And, I would guess that in Oregon, it's 1,843,539 acres. And of that, there'd be 19,033 on private or state land. So if what you're saying is actually a lot more than that, then hypothetically, if the draft EIS has those numbers in it, it would not be accurate, which would give quite a bit.
Yeah, and here again, unfortunately, you know, I don't have any detailed information from Oregon. That was just a general comment.
Well, I guess your general comment has intrigued me a whole bunch, so if you have any factual information, get it to me.
Well, I can't get any facts for Oregon, you know, that.
Well, for the whole 10 million acres, because of it's 10 million acres, 5 different states, 5 different states, I guess. If it is double the amount, it would impact the whole, because the draft EIS will be for all states. So if you got any factual information that shows that there's more than what's gonna be proposed in that, I need.
No, I don't, you know, I don't. I have, you know, off the record people that, you know, have made that comment to me. And the process was confirmed by somebody inadvertently at the state. But as to details in Oregon, no, I don't have a clue.
Hey,
You know,
Dick?
you gave me a number that's a lot more comfortable than, you know, than what I've heard before, but, yes, John?
My understanding, we ran into that this summer with one of the claimants out there. I know they came up with the formula, 50% more or greater is gonna exclude the whole section. But what we're finding out in the system right now, when they look up a section, if that SFA or the withdrawal line is even touching that section, the computer says that whole section cannot be locatable minerals done on it, just because that section comes up in the computer as having a line touching it somewhere.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, the whole 50% rule was a closely guarded secret, and when I started discussing it with some of my other contacts, they were amazed that, you know, that I'd come across it, because they had been told explicitly that that was confidential BLM information.
Yeah, and we know the people sitting behind the desk, if they look up a certain section and it pops up as being part of the withdrawal, even though the line's just touching the corner of it, they're not gonna allow any location in that whole section unless you file an appeal and go through the process to prove, which is what the claimant had to do this summer.
Well, that's where Commissioner Winters, being on that committee, needs to call the BLM management task on that. It should be habitat, not legal
Well,
description.
they need to straighten the lines or clarify, you know, if they're gonna put this section in, or if they're only gonna take half of it
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, that's.
Which we were told by the gentleman from Washington, they were gonna clarify the map, you know, go back in and straighten the lines out, and that'll never happen.
Well, we need to hold them to
Well,
it.
I mean, what was really interesting is one of my other informants was back there in Washington during a period where they were kind of putting all this thing together, trying to decide what they were going to do. The people doing the planning were asked, well, how much is it going to cost, and how long is it going to take to come up with this boundary? Everybody looked at each other, and the one person that was knowledgeable about mapping and GIS, stood up and said, well, given current resources, it's going to take 10 years and $10 million to do it. Well, it hasn't been 10 years and nobody's given them any money to do it, so that should tell you what the end product is going to be like.
Well,
Unless they found some other resource to do it. I know that people are working almost day and night developing this boundary. And it's going to be interesting to see what it ultimately turns out to be and whether they're going to be amenable to making any changes to it. I have been told that boundary is mutable, that the boundary can be changed, and that the boundary has been changed in the process. So I don't know what that means, other than some examples that were given to me, like they put an SFA right in the middle of a 40-acre open pit mine. You know, so obviously when that was brought to their attention, they changed that. And there were some other SFAs that were located above 8,000 feet in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
So those have been changed.
What we have going on in the state of Oregon, it's interesting that you made a comment about the environmental group tweaking the maps a little bit, unbeknownst to others. But the federal agency is still relying on the old DFW habitat maps, even though there might have been a tweak by the environmentalists. We need to clear about that. But we do have the state revisiting their habitat maps. It's on their agenda in the budget process, actually. But that's only a piece. That's just getting the data
Well, see,
corrected.
that's one of the problems with the whole process is that, has anybody told the sage-grouse, where they're supposed to stay?
Yeah.
I haven't heard of any process by which those SFA areas can be changed, for management reasons.
The FFAs, the FS whatever, is the Bureau of Land Management underneath their EIS, so that's a different elephant to tackle.
Right, but if they're withdrawing land because it's prime, well, that's not even true. They withdrew land based on the premise that it was probably
Yes.
well,
good habitat now, or could be habitat in the future.
It could be aspect.
or
It's
was
based on the
habitat.
best science, Dick.
Here in
It's a
Oregon,
smoke.
Dick, and I've had this argument all the way back, is what they're basing this on is the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife mapping of core habitat, medium habitat, whatever you call it, all the way down, and the whole withdrawal is based around those maps, which I know factually they are not accurate and correct. And the whole thing is trying to get people together to get a consultant together to have those maps redone. The state of Oregon says, yeah, they'll relook at them, but they're a non-regulating agency, which is considered good science. And so when the BLM adopts what is considered good science, their mapping, that's where our problem is, and I'm speaking just for Oregon and for Lake County. That, I think, is the biggest problem we have, which, to change that, we can't wait for the state of Oregon to say, yeah, we're gonna relook at those maps. When they relook at them, how many more acres are they gonna add in?
Well, I mean, take a step backwards even further. I mean, the premise is, in Oregon, that the sage-grouse are endangered. Well, nobody's ever made that argument in Oregon. Fish and Wildlife never put them on the endangered list. They haven't even put them on the threatened list, as far as I know. They've been put on a list, to be watched closely because the population trends do go up and down. But that's what's so frustrating is that the end result is supposed to be protect the sage-grouse, and nobody's ever proved that the sage-grouse need protecting. I mean, anecdotal information this summer, out there is, I've seen more sage-grouse this summer than I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, driving over Hart Mountain and down into the Catawba Valley, I mean, they're as thick as pheasants out there. I've never had to worry about having a sage-grouse come through my windshield on my truck, but I certainly did this summer.
Yeah, due to weather conditions, a lot of the wildlife populations are coming up. That was my argument with BLM in my letter I submitted even to Secretary Buell was, you know, some of us that are out there in these locations for months on end are a viable resource of what's happening in those local habitats. To come out and talk to us and see what's happening out there with nature, you know, the coyotes, the birds, the gophers, the rodents, it doesn't matter. You can see the ebb and flow. Nobody's
Yeah.
ever contacted us for any information. And as far as the best science, looking at the Delgamy report and the Oregon Fish and Wildlife report, well, Fish and Wildlife report was put out in 2011. The most current scientific data they had in their reference notes, I think, was late 70s, early 80s. So we're talking almost 30-year-old data. And Delgamy, I think their most recent was maybe early 90s. So if they're basing it on best science, you know, 30, 40-year-old science isn't the best science.
Oh, no. But then again, you're assuming again that the whole purpose is to protect the sage-grouse, and I don't think that's the purpose of this exercise at all. I think it's simply, you know, a push by the environmentalists to invalidate the 1872 mining law.
I do not disagree with you one bit on that. The real motives are usually not published.
Well, I mean, like in Oregon, going back again to specifics, the reason for withdrawing 2 million acres of federal land in Oregon is to protect the sage-grouse against the encroachment of mining activity. I mean, that's the reason, all right? That's the whole driving force behind the whole sage-grouse management plan effort in Oregon. Well, if you look at reality, on the sage-grouse study area, not the SFAs, but the entire area that they limit, or that they chose to study sage-grouse in the state of Oregon, there's only 550 acres of disturbed land. So in order to protect the sage-grouse from an increase of 550 acres of disturbed land, they're going to withdraw 2 million acres. I mean, you know, logically that doesn't hold together. I mean, you can't, that's not a logical argument.
I agree with you, Dick, and one of my arguments through this whole process is that there needs to be, whatever alternative comes out of the process, there needs to be a place for mitigation, because of within the state, on the Sage-grouse side of it, mitigation is allowed. And so on the BLM lands, let's say that whatever alternative comes out, there should be a way to mitigate on some of this mining.
Well, see, one of the problems you have with that, and you know, here again, it gets back into the arcane parts of the law. Under the 1872 mining law, okay, and that's fixed. That's a law that the agencies have to develop regulations to work within the constraints of the law. There's nothing in the 1872 mining law that calls for mitigation. And this is one of the things that's really stuck crosswise, you know, in the throats of all the environmentalists and even the BLM staff, is that they cannot ask for mitigation on anything related to a mining claim. And
So I'm following where you're going, but on the mining laws, there's reclamation that goes along with it, which would be similar to a mitigation type thing. So, depending on what words you want to use.
But you can't, but what the Obama administration has imposed, and this is another one of those regulations they came up with, the Obama regulations require that you come up with mitigation before you do your disturbance. So if you're going to disturb 5 acres, they want you to do kind of mitigation action prior to disturbing the 5 acres, where the 1872 mining law says, hey, you can use this 5 acres, you can go ahead and mine it, you can't do any undue or unnecessary degradation, and then when you're done, you reclaim it. But there's no call for mitigation.
Yeah, we basically have to inform them what our intent is for our plans, and then we have to, on our end, show the math, how we come up with the reasonable amount to cover the reclamation cost. They review it, they accept it. I guess that's basically what you might call mitigation, but it's not. We have to prove on our end what we're
Well,
gonna
no,
do,
it's
how
not,
we're gonna
you know,
do
it's the
it.
fact that they can't require us to go ahead and create a 5-acre marsh in exchange for them letting us mine on 5 acres of desert. You know, that's what mitigation calls for. Or contributing to a mitigation bank, which is what they're now requesting of a lot of the ranchers, that, you know, in order to get their grazing plans adopted, you know, they have to contribute to a mitigation bank. Well, see, they can do that under the grazing laws. But, and you know, and that's one of the reasons I think the mining is taking such a strong hit, is the agencies are pretty much constrained under the 1872 mining law, whereas most of the other management actions aren't.
So
But,
earlier.
you know, there again, it's pretty minor for something in Oregon. You know, maybe in Utah and Montana and Idaho, that's significant, but, you know, for us here in Oregon, it's not.
No, it's not.
Okay, so earlier, Dick, when you first started out, you mentioned that through all this and everything, that there'd probably be some middle ground or someplace that would come to push, go to shove, and this and that. So what do you see, what kind of alternative do you see? And you're talking pretty strong against mitigation. So what kind of alternative or what kind of other thoughts do you have as this goes forward?
Well, you know, don't get me wrong. I'm not against mitigation. It's just that, you know, I've been strongly reminded several times that, you know, it's not part of the mining laws.
Right.
And that really concerns the BLM. You know, everything else, you know, that's kind of the way we do business now when we're talking about natural resources now is we want to do some mitigation, minimization of damage and mitigation where we can. So, I mean, that's kind of, you know, part of all of our resource usage, I guess. But, so, you know, I don't really have anything against it personally.
Well, I tell you, about 98% or whatever percent of miners or hunters or loggers or whatever or cattlemen respect and want to preserve and take care of the environment out there. And most of them probably go above and beyond whenever it comes to reclamation or mitigation or whatever. What ends up is that smaller percentage is the part that hurts everybody.
That's the part that the environmentalist jumps on.
Yep.
Well, and you know, but you can see that in almost everything.
Exactly, that's my point.
You know, it's always that little minority that just, you know, paints everybody in that group, you know, with a brush.
Yeah, so that's what we're dealing with as we go through this, yeah, and that's what's going to be the example that is used against us. As we use the good examples on the other side. And I guess what I'm looking at is trying to educate myself through this informational meeting here the best I can as this process goes forward, because of something's going to come out of it, and we want the best outcome we can have. We would rather stay with exactly what the mining law is today, but this withdrawal has high potential of something happening because it's a 20-year withdrawal. It can be signed by the undersecretary.
And almost any withdrawal for 20 years becomes almost automatic for the next 20 and the next 20.
Exactly.
And there's no way you can reverse the process once it's there, unless they accidentally forget to sign the
Well,
paper.
you know, you can. This is going to be one of the interesting things to see what Trump's going to do. It would be interesting to see whether he would consider direct directing the new Secretary of the Interior to cancel some of the withdrawals that have been made. I mean, that's kind of a perfect example of, you know, the things that he's saying that he wants to do.
Yeah, he
And
says to come to,
this one's gonna be halfway through the process, a little over halfway through the process when he takes office, correct?
Well, we don't know. Here again, it's back to, tell me when the draft EIS for the withdrawal is gonna be available.
yeah, we don't have the end date.
Hey, Dick, did I send you a
Yeah.
copy of that executive order on the secretary's executive powers? I think I did last year, but it's been a while. It's Executive Order 10355. It was passed in 1952.
Oh, yes, okay.
That's the one where, unfortunately, you know, it's like I was explaining to Ken a bit, Brad wasn't in here yet, that this executive order, while we're going through this lame duck process, the reelection, the appointment of a new secretary, that a lot of these projects are passed down with the power of the secretary. Let's see, let me find it. The Secretary of the Interior is authorized to redelegate an authority delegated to him or her in this fact by this order to one or more of the following designated officers: the Undersecretary of the Interior and the Assistant Secretaries of the Interior. So if they're overseeing all these projects with the power of the Secretary of the Interior, they're still gonna be working on these projects during this transition, and a lot of stuff's gonna be finalized and pushed through while everybody's looking the other way at other issues. That's my thought.
Undersecretaries are serving at the consent of the president. They're all gonna resign on the day that Trump takes office.
Yeah, but we still got 60, or they could've been working on this stuff for 6 months now, stuff that's going on that, you know, is not as public as the Sage-grouse process that I'm concerned is gonna go through without, well, it's like the Section 204. Okay, ruling part of that unconstitutional, they just took the power away from Congress to review and approve these larger withdrawals. They're basically saying the secretary herself can do these larger 20-year withdrawals.
All right.
And so what's to stop her from sitting down in the next 6 weeks and signing a whole bunch of withdrawal papers to put everybody into panic and withdraw almost every acreage of public land? There's
Well,
nothing.
because you can't just, you know, withdraw it. You have to go through the process. You have to do a segregation, and then you have to do a NEPA process, and you have to do a minerals potential study.
Like they
Yeah.
did with the sage-grouse, right?
Pardon?
Like they did with the sage-grouse process.
Yes, yeah, well, and over there on the Siskiyou project, down there on the Chetco River, that one was done as, initially it was done because, I can't remember, the congressman down there in that area submitted a bill in the House to create a wilderness area, or expand a wilderness area. And so that one was done, it started as one of those in support of legislation ones that started the withdrawal process, that done all of the work. And then when the bill wasn't going anywhere, then Secretary Jewell stepped in, and they have amended the process, and they've changed it from in support of legislation to at the request of federal agencies. And she had, and then they did their NEPA document, and they said that to withdraw, I forgot what it was, 6,000 acres or something, that it would have no significant environmental impact, so they signed a finding of no significant impact. They did a minerals potential study that was basically done by one of the local geologists who determined that there was no mineral potential in the area they withdrawn. And so they sent the whole package to her, and she's going to sign it. But valley to where you got a lot of environmental support. So it's probably gonna go, even though the NEPA process on there was flawed, and the minerals potential study that they did, basically is not supported by the Dagami study that came along a year later. So, they just kind of make it up as they go. And that's the problem. But I would expect to see that she will sign a segregation for the Oahe Canyonlands area before the end of the year. The Cascade Divide one down there will probably be done. She just did one to expand Yellowstone by 30,000 acres. She just signed the segregation document on that one last week. So I would anticipate to see a bunch of them come along.
Well, that's kind of my question real quick. You were talking about the citizens were involved in this 6,000 acre withdrawal. Well, Yellowstone's an example. They got their 6,000. Do those local citizens not understand that they're gonna come in and start chunking away, well, under her authority, 5,000 acres at a time?
No, you just kind of wonder sometimes. But then again, who's that always sounds so nice, 5,000 acres. Well, or 30,000 acres for Yellowstone. It's Yellowstone. We need to protect that.
A lot of gold and other stuff are in those volcanic.
Oh yeah. Well, to say nothing of geothermal or anything else.
I have several things down for us to work on. Whatever Secretary Jules does in the next 5 weeks, she's going to do. The ultimate task is to have that change under the new administration. And that requires a congressional delegation to be abreast and to have conferences with the new administration. But the other things on habitat delineation, I'm working with ODFW, it's on their docket to reassess. Brad's going to form an independent assessment on withdrawal on the legal description of the withdrawals, on the 50% rule on a segment. We're just going to have to keep petitioning our congressional delegation to fine tune that. The thing is, those things are just incremental building blocks. It doesn't alleviate the fact of the withdrawal. That's where we have to petition our congressional and work with other states to negate anything that Secretary Jules may do in her last weeks.
Yes. And one of the things that Trump hasn't done is he hasn't given out any hints as to who he's going to choose for Interior Secretary.
Right.
But it's going to be very interesting.
I'll volunteer.
What we need to do. Go ahead.
I think Denise needs to have a tour in DC. But the other
I was
thing,
saying that this morning.
the other thing is the Bureau of Land Management 2.0. That is a gross undermining of the coordination of FLIPMA. We need to get a congressional delegation, those willing. And also, we ourselves not going to change things, but we can plant a seed. So for the new administration to be aware of concerns.
Well, that was basically my question to Walden last year. I wasn't, everybody I talked to, I said, okay, I know you got a lot of things you're working on. I need help with this. Where do I go? Who do I talk to? Just give me a direction so we can start someplace. Everybody kind of acts like they don't know the answer either, and I'm just asking, which direction do we start? I mean, do we have to do like Burns? I hope not, but.
Well, to be honest, I get frustrated with Walden and his staff sometimes. I have a very difficult time making contact with them, simply because, I'm not a constituent, so I can't give anything to him.
You have a business in this area, Dick, so you kind of are, you have an interest, that's.
Yes.
So, yeah, I was thinking about Thursday, taking a drive down to Hood River and see if I can catch him at home on Thursday.
You know his exact residence? I'm in Hood River periodically.
You know, I could probably find out, but
I have a couple of contacts in Hood River.
Careful, we're being
well,
recorded.
yeah, I do too. So.
One of them is an extremely strong Republican. She
Okay.
knows where he lives.
Okay.
Let the voter turn out.
Well, my biggest fear with this footnote ruling and everything is, as you know, and we've talked about, that opens the door. If they can turn part of the process off, they're gonna start turning more of the lights out, to where
Well,
Congress has no oversight.
Yeah, well, here's a good way to look at it too. What they're proposing in BLM 2.0 is just exactly what they've done in the Sage-grouse. The process they've followed to get us to where we are right now in the Sage-grouse is exactly what they want to put into regulation. I mean, they don't want to deal with the local people. They want to make the decisions back in Washington and then simply just impose it upon everybody.
Yeah, and that's been, in the federal agencies, the two primary land management agencies, Forest Service and the BLM management. They've been gravitating, they haven't been, they've been directed from above and gravitating that for some years. This 2.0 is just another stepping stone in that direction of government overreach.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I agree with that.
Well, 2.0 is not government, that's basically bureaucracy.
Governmental bureaucracies.
There you go. Because if it was government, it'd be Congress doing it, but it's not, they're taking it away from
Government
government.
is bigger. Government is the administrative branch also.
Yeah.
So,
So, yeah, you know, and I would recommend that you guys might want to, you know, touch base with Cliff Bentz. You know, he seems to be one of the movers and shakers in Eastern Oregon that
yes.
at least has got the attention in Salem. At least he returns my phone calls.
He's
So-
good.
But, and he claims that he's got the ear of White and Merkley also. So, you know, that might be another opportunity is if in fact he does have the rear, you know, that's just one more tool.
Well, Cliff is good at, some people try to dictate to a congressional delegation and some people try to persuade. And he's a good persuader
Okay.
because
Well, he's an
he uses facts.
So, yeah, he's always trying to convince me to donate to his campaign, so.
Uh-huh.
Well, he lives in Malheur County. I think the mining withdrawal impacts him quite a bit.
Yeah, he had a,
The Delgamy report, there's a lot of mineral potential in Malheur County.
yes. Yeah, he, as you know, he had that town hall meeting over a year or so ago and where the environmental group gave their rationale and it was an overwhelming attendance, matter of fact, standing room only. And
Oh, yeah.
overall,
Yeah, that was his hearing on the Oahe Canyon.
uh,
And,
yeah,
and
I attended that. It was,
And it was shortly after that that White and Merkley submitted their bills to create wilderness.
right, as a compromise.
I just love when they
Yeah.
show up at the meetings, the environmentalists, they all drive their hundreds of cars up there and they say they're there to protect the environment.
While they're polluting the air with their
Well, if
cars.
it burns, they were more of a problem than anybody else when they showed up in the
Yeah,
area.
but you're expecting consistency, you know, you don't find that.
Well, I think rural America needs to cut all supplies off for 1 week and see what happens. Then they'll realize how important rural America is.
Why 1 week? It may take longer.
That'd only take a week. Trust me, the way the stores do everything just in time.
Just before Christmas.
Yeah, about 15th of December maybe.
Well, there's several things that we'll follow up on.
Okay, well, there's some things here that I've got notes on that I'll follow up on too. And I'll keep you informed, you know, as to what I can find out. And I'd certainly appreciate, you know, that one gem of material that, you know, when I can expect to see the draft EIS. So, but the rest of the stuff, you know, I'll keep
those,
hopefully we can, you know, take advantage of this new administration to get some things changed.
that
Really
is,
stop.
that is our ace in the deck. Yeah, there's other things that was last minute tossed in on EISs of the Bureau of Land Management. That was the research natural areas, and that was after about 6 or 9 months of silence, they came out with the EIS and threw that in at the last minute.
Well, you know, that's the other thing that's kind of crazy. I mean, we're worried about something else, you know, right now, but if we have a chance to go back and correct some problems, I mean, if you look at that whole corner of southeastern Oregon down there, there's a tremendous amount of land that's basically already taken off the table. They've got, you know, a significant number of wilderness study areas that, you know, they can do that administratively. They can just create a wilderness study area, and that effectively is a withdrawal for up to 20
There's
years.
RNAs or ACECs.
Yes, yes, all of those things are just little piecemeal stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, at one time, oh, I forgot how long ago it was, but at one point, there was a change of administrations, and they came back to the Interior Department and they said, okay, fine, you have 90 days to review all of these administrative withdrawals and justify them. Those that aren't justified will be eliminated. And so at that time, and I wish I could remember exactly when it was, they cleaned out a whole bunch of that stuff nationwide. Not much here in Oregon because we hadn't been subjected to a lot of that at that point, but it was significant. Hopefully we can get something like that out of the Trump administration and, you know, clean some of those out. If they haven't declared wilderness down there in those areas, or they haven't made a determination that they merit wilderness status, then take off the restrictions on it.
Well, you just raised one of my pet peeves, gets concerns.
Only one?
No, you raised one of them, is the WSAs. It was never intended to be de facto perpetual. And that's a case of a congressional delegation is in a no-win situation. If they eliminate some, then they tick off one element of society. If they don't, then they tick off the other. So it's inaction by a congressional delegation to act on those.
Land use audit.
Well, I'm working on getting one of them either as a wilderness or taken off at this point.
I know which way they're gonna go.
Haven't visited them.
But with
for a little while.
the new administration and the new Congress, now may be a chance to push on many different aspects at many different levels.
Well, we could hope.
Well, appreciate it. Thanks, Dick.
All right.
Thank you, Dick.
All right, well, we'll keep in touch, and thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys.
Well, we appreciate your participation and info. Thank you.
All right, good luck.
I'll conclude the session at 22 after 11.